Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today on the IcePick NARUC Brown Bag broadcast on transportation sector, power sector, interdependencies in times of emergencies. We're joined today by some really great speakers. I'd like to start by, as always, thanking the Department of Energy for their support in our ongoing summertime only Brown Bag broadcast series. Let me just start by giving a little bit of background. The background of the series that we're doing is that we're trying to put into the marketplace of ideas some of the best ideas and some of the best minds that are working on these ideas across the range of the kinds of electricity policy problems that are facing us kilowatt geeks here in the Eastern Interconnection and across the country. And you may not agree with all the speakers that we have, you may not agree with the topics, but the purpose is to inject these ideas into the conversation nationally and to give ourselves a forum for exploring a broad range of electricity policy topics. Today, as always, to manage the audio chaos that is inevitable when we take everybody off mute. Y'all are all on mute. Who are listeners, and only the speakers and panelists are taken off mute. That said, as always, we love and encourage your questions and comments. Please participate throughout by using the questions function that's over there on the right-hand side of your webcast software. I'll be watching those like a hawk while we go through our conversation. And if it's something clarifying, I'll interrupt the speakers, and if it's something discussive, we'll have a great Q&A session at the tail end of this thing, and I'll manage putting your questions into as many of them as we can handle into the conversation. Let me do one other thing before we start the conversation. Carrie Worthington, are you there?
Good afternoon.
Carrie, pipe up a little louder, but would you mind reminding us all what an IcePick is?
Sure. The Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council is an organization of state utility commissions and energy offices that share the Eastern Interconnection transmission system. We have over 20 reports on transmission planning and analyses, and moving forward, we are working in 5 work areas, including reliability and recovery, resource adequacy, and air and energy resources.
And it's a waterproof tarp when it rains, and it helps you get your dishes just that much cleaner in the dishwasher. Thanks for joining us. Carrie, I spend a lot of time in the summertime feeling pretty unhappy out in the woods. Guess what everyone else in my family likes to do that I hate to do?
Probably camping, based off of those webinar descriptions.
Yeah, it's camping. Yeah, Sharon Thomas from my office suggested that it was hunting. Yeah, I'm not game for that, actually. I can actually imagine myself getting chased by guys with guns through the forest, and so just on that basis, I don't think I'd be very good at it. No, camping. I hate camping. I'm scared of tents, and I feel like they're too easily opened by animals that belong outside the tent, and I'd much rather have sturdy walls. That makes me admire utility restoration crews all that much more. These guys head across country to restore power when it goes out, and they are truly an example of how we're stronger together. What happens as a basis for power restoration is when things are too big for one company to handle with getting the power back on, they call on mutual assistance, which is a voluntary partnership between the different power companies that allow them to share equipment, personnel, supplies, information, all kinds of stuff based on prearranged agreements. And the crews often travel hundreds of miles to rebuild power lines, to help put in place restorative infrastructure after disasters. After Katrina, we spent a little bit of time on this because a lot of crews had trouble with, some crews had trouble with access and credentialing, and we engaged in a national conversation that, to my understanding, seemed to put this thing to bed. And I thought that this was, that utility restoration, as miraculous as it is in the United States, was something that we had gotten nailed down pretty much perfectly. And then a few weeks ago, Sharon Thomas from my crew and I were invited to engage in some conversation with some folks who were in the restoration game, who had identified some problems, some of which I'd never heard of, but some of which were hair-pullingly familiar. And even 7 years after Katrina, and even after having gotten a lot of Hurricane Sandy restoration or Superstorm Sandy restoration really well, and even though we're the aces in this game internationally, there's still some stuff that that perplexingly remains on the list of things out there that we can do better. I'm joined today to explore this topic by two guys who are kilowatt geeks like we all are, but with emergency credentials buttoned onto their shoulders here. Tom Moran is the executive director of the All Hazards Consortium, which is a 501c3 that looks at multi-state homeland security and emergency management. He's been working with the MultiState Fleet Response Working Group, which is a conversation that is trying to unpack a bunch of these problems. We're also lucky to have Cal Kretzinger on the line with us. He's from Ameren, which is one of my favorite mid-American, middle of the country electric and gas utilities. And he served as the fleet administrator for the Missouri and Illinois fleet from 2001 to 2009. So he's gotten his hands on this firsthand. And since 2009, he served as the general executive in the emissions control, commodities, and fuel business development, the energy managing and trading group for Ameren. And as I said, has some firsthand experience with this. So how we'll do this is we'll have Tom go first and walk us through the high level. We'll have Cal go next and walk us through the hands-on firsthand experience stuff. And then we'll have a conversation about why hasn't this thing already been solved? How much of this is at all within the wheelhouse of commissioners to help us unpack, or those of us who are allied with commissioners in the kilowatt geek world, and what do we do? How do we fix this thing? So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tom. Tom, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, Tom, you may want to pipe up just a little bit, and I've got your.
Okay. Okay, how's that? Sound better?
Yeah, it sounds great. Go for it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Miles, for inviting Cal and I on. I met Cal several weeks ago at a meeting regarding another issue. But let me just give you all just a quick background. After Irene, many companies in the electric sector approached DHS to say we've had enough. Crossing state lines with our mutual assistance is driving us crazy. We have all kinds of delays for a variety of reasons. We got to fix it. So DHS contacted us because they know we work on multi-state issues, meaning 3 or more states. And so we had a meeting in December of 2011. And there were a number of sectors there, utilities from telecom and power, oil, gas, food, retail, finance. It was a big issue, telecom sector I mentioned. So they decided at that meeting that they wanted to work on a number of issues. I said, if you're going to work with states, we had 2 states in the room, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, you have to pick one problem. You can't work credentialing with fleet movement, with information sharing. So they decided fleet movement was the biggest issue, and they wanted to focus on the electric sector. Well, the planning was kind of slow until the derecho hit in mid-2012. That sped things up, and then when Sandy hit in late 2012, that was kind of all she wrote. So the utilities quickly got together and asked the states of the All Hazards Consortium, could we form a work group underneath you folks, under your 501c3, where we could work operational issues. So they chartered the Multi-State Fleet Response Working Group. It's run by the private sector. It's advised by state emergency management directors, and it works on a number of issues relating to the electric sector, and in any products they produce are quickly shared with the accompanying sector. So long story short, they started looking at these issues, and in the planning process, they decided that we've really got to begin sharing sensitive operational information. in order for states to respond and help you on the emergency management transportation front. So what you're looking at on the screen right now is a picture of an actual storm that occurred in late 2013. That was an ice storm that hit Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. So in May of 2013, they came up with this idea: what if the regional mutual assistance groups were to share some information with the states? And that started this whole fleet movement data exchange process. But what the states were not, let's go to the next slide, Miles. What the states were not privy to as a larger region was kind of this pass-through state problem. So Miles covered a little bit of this already. The big issue is as the mutual assistance groups light it up, they come out of those calls usually 3 days or 4 days ahead of time for notice events. For no notice events, it's done as quickly as they can. And they come out of that with certain information that can be helpful to the states if they share that with them. What the states were not up to speed on is, many of the states during a big mobilization are in blue sky mode, meaning the sun is shining, there's no declaration of emergency, and they're in business as usual. Well, they may not be aware that 75 trucks or 100 trucks are going to hit their borders from the south and head north, or head west or whatever. They may not be aware those kind of fleets are hitting their borders, and there's all kinds of issues that come up when you hit the border. There's way stations you have to stop at. If they're open, you have to stop. If they're closed, you can go through them, but you have to stop if they're there. There's paperwork issues sometimes. Every state is autonomous in how they do this for some issues. And so it was really, how do we notify all these blue sky, what we call pass-through states, that these fleets are moving, and can you help expedite them through toll stations somehow, or way stations? Can we use commercially restricted roads? Is there any other situational awareness that we need to know while we pass through your state? And do you have a declaration, or are you planning to declare? Those are the same 5 topics that we get asked all the time. So it's how do we alert these pass-through states? And so the consortium's fleet working group is kind of working this issue to share information just to alert the states so they can help. Once the states know, most of them go out of their way to help with the problem. But this is an ongoing issue, and it's an information sharing, it's a trust issue, it's a number of different things. But I think as we work this issue, and Cal's going to talk about this, is we have many other things that come into play as far as what is a Florida truck, what rights does an operating authority, does a Florida truck have in Tennessee? And I'll let Cal talk to that one. So Miles, let's jump ahead to the next slide here, and I'll wrap it up. So through integrated planning, we bring public and private sector operations people together, and we help them try to understand, hey, this is our shared problem. Today, your state might be the impacted state. Tomorrow, you're the pass-through state. So we got to come up with a process that works legally, that's safe, and that can run in blue sky day all the time, so we don't have to ramp up or educate people because we've gone into black sky mode, because you have elections, you have turnover and retirements, and the former person was really on board. The new person in the state has never heard of this. So we've got to find ways to institutionalize parts of this, because let's go to the next slide. I think the big idea we've learned here, and I'll wrap up, is an hour delay in a pass-through state can begin a daisy chain that can result in as much as 24-hour delay in the impacted state. So this is a big issue. The states are autonomous, so they have their own rights to a lot of this stuff, and it has to really be worked state by state. So our role here is to help work with organizations like NARUC and work with Cal and begin to foster processes that are legal, that are safe, and that really help the utilities get there and get to work quicker. Once they're in the state, they know how to do their jobs. It's just getting them there a day ahead of time could be a big win. So, Miles, again, thank you. That's it for my portion of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Let me turn things over to Cal Kretzinger. Before I do that, y'all should just know I'm not sure that Cal can see what we can see. So it may sound just a little bit funny as we back and forth through the slides just a little bit. You'll hear my voice a little more than usual. Apologies about that, but learning as we go. Cal, are you there?
I am Miles. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience and Tom for participating and for this forum. You're right, I haven't been able to, my company hasn't been able to get me onto the webinar, but I have the slide deck in front of me, and I'm at the slide that shows all the different types of storms. If that's where you are, Miles, then we can proceed.
That's where we are now. Go ahead.
Great, okay. Obviously to this audience, they're familiar with the different types of storms and disasters that utilities are dealing with. But what I wanted to put in play here is the kind of the extent of this. I did a little study and went back through my records and everything, and since 2006, I've been involved in 26 major storm restoration events. That's defined by we actually activated our emergency operations centers or responded to someone else's storm. So that doesn't always mean we brought in outside resources, but in a lot of cases we have brought in outside resources. So just since 2006, that's 26 major events. Next slide. We know that there's a financial impact, but that's not what drives a lot of us. I mean, we understand that there's actual human hardship involved in these storms. And if it's a summer storm or a winter storm, we know that there are elderly out there and there are folks that are disabled, and the lack of electricity can actually be a life or death matter for these folks. Next. So we really pull all of our bones out of joint to try and get the power back on. I mean, we will bring in all necessary resources, whatever it takes. We have a list of people that are homebound and on life support. Of course, they're our primary restoration target, but then we're also trying to get the largest number of people back on at a time that we can, so we target that. And we've obviously got hospitals and water supply and sewer, police, fire, and ambulance. All those things need to be brought back on so that people are relieved from their suffering, and we just put a high priority on all that. Next slide. Obviously, utilities cannot staff for an emergency event. We can't have hundreds of extra linemen and hundreds of extra trucks just sitting around waiting for a storm restoration event. So we have to rely on, next slide, we have to rely on outside resources, and a lot of those resources are other utilities, and utilities have grouped together by geographic location into regional mutual aid assistance groups, and they all get together periodically. They plan on how they're going to respond to these disasters, and obviously then the different regions have interconnected agreements so that we can just keep calling on resources outside the affected area until we get what we need to put the power back on as safely and quickly as we can. Next slide. This is an aerial shot of our general office building campus in St. Louis, Missouri. It was taken in the morning sometime during the 2006 storm restoration effort. That was one of our biggest ones we've had. And you're looking at basket trucks and line trucks that haven't left yet for the restoration for the day. If you'd have taken a picture of this a little bit earlier, you'd have seen the parking lot full. You would have seen the streets full of trucks. You would have seen another parking lot to the east of this picture full of trucks. And then you would have also seen parking lots in the St. Louis area and out in the West County area, about 1,000 trucks at the amphitheater parking lot. The idea is we can literally bring in thousands of these large trucks during a restoration event to get the power back on quickly. Next slide. As Tom and Miles have been saying, the state that is affected, for example, Missouri, will issue an emergency declaration. And what that does is once all these utilities get there from other states, they have operating authority in Missouri by virtue of that emergency declaration. But it's all the other pass-through states that they have to go through that present the problem. Next slide. When utilities buy these large trucks and they assign them to a local works headquarters operating center, it's with the idea that they will never have to leave that operating center. They'll never have to leave that neighborhood or that service territory. And so it's only, just like it's not financially responsible thing to do to have hundreds of extra trucks and linemen just in case an emergency. It's not a financially responsible thing to do to license our trucks for interstate travel when typically they're never going to leave their local location. Next slide. When the DOT issues an emergency declaration, there's really only one thing that's doing for us, and that is an exemption from hours of service. And you may know that utilities a few years back already gained, through the help of EEI and a lot of others, an exemption from hours of service. So but it also, what it does not do is provide an exemption for hours of service for all the tree trimming trucks we bring in, for the emergency fueling trucks we bring in, and all those ancillary suppliers and providers. So it's important that we get the hours of service exemption. But what the DOT has no authority to do, and what no other federal jurisdiction has the authority to do, is to issue an emergency declaration that gives these utility trucks operating authority through the pass-through states. That ability solely lies with each state. And typically, if it's not their disaster, they are not going to issue an emergency declaration so that a utility truck can pass through their state to get to the affected state. What we're talking about primarily here are the trucks that are over 26,000 pounds, and we're talking about the larger digger derricks and the basket trucks, the trucks that we really need to restore the power during these disasters. And so if this was an over-the-road trucking company, which is what all the laws are written for, they would buy apportioned plates because they routinely, day after day, travel through different states. And the apportioned plates would give them operating authority under the Unified Carrier Registration Program to travel wherever they need to go. However, the states obtain their revenue from these large trucks to maintain their roads, the wear and tear that these large trucks meet on their roads, by forming two corporations, IRP, the International Registration Plan Incorporated, and IFTA, the International Fuel Tax Agreement. Next slide. So IRP is an organization that administers the apportioned license plate program. So if you buy an apportioned license plate, you're buying that from a state, and it's running through the IRP, and you are agreeing that you will track your mileage, and that monthly you will, or quarterly, I can't remember which, you will report that mileage and send reimbursement to IRP for the miles traveled in each state, and IRP then administers those funds and gets the money back to the state. Works very effectively for 99.5% of the normal everyday interstate traffic, but it does nothing for utilities. Our utility, for example, if we have 1,000 large trucks, we may only have 3 or 4 large trucks that have apportioned plates because they're transmission department trucks and they routinely cross state lines. But the rest of our fleet will not have apportioned plates. The other entity is IFTA, and it works the same way. Drivers will record their mileage, they'll make their payments to IFTA, and IFTA disperses those monies to the states. And if you sign up for apportioned plates, then you participate in this program, the states get their money, and everybody's happy. But some states in the past, I know, haven't even allowed you to sign up for apportioned plates in their areas unless you were routinely passing through their states. The only way you could get permission or operating authority in their states was through a temporary permit. Next slide. So when the emergency call goes out to the RMAGs, to all the different utilities, they really have 2 options on how to cross through these pass-through states. Number 1, they can apply for temporary trip permits through IFTA and IRP, which will allow them to travel from their home state through the pass-through states to the affected state. And the other, as we talked about, is emergency declaration from the host state. But chances are most states nowadays are not going to just honor that and then let you go through the pass-through states. Next slide. As we talk about this, we need to remember that we need a solution that is going to be understood by everyone. And Ameren responds to a lot of storms, and we ask a lot of people to come and help us during major storms. But there are other utilities that don't get called very often. I would call them, in this case, the second tier in utility response. And because they don't get called very often, and because there's a change in fleet management personnel and so on, they may not have a clue on how to go about getting through several pass-through states to get to the affected state. They may not know that they need to do it. They may think that they can go through emergency declarations, and they probably don't have a contract with, like we do, with a contractor that arranges for our permits for us. And so, as I guess the lesson here is, as the storm gets worse and we go to the second tier states, the problem gets worse. Next slide. Either way, whether they go for the emergency permits or the temporary permits or the emergency declarations, the delay for the fleet can be 12 to 48 hours. I know a lot of utilities don't know about this. A lot of utilities may just think, well, it's a noble cause. They don't even think about the licensing, and they just go. And actually, they don't have operating authority to go through the pass-through states. Others may think, well, we've applied for the permits, but it's going to take 12 hours. We're just going to go ahead and leave, and we'll get the permits along the way. There's a huge civil liability attached with that action. Our attorney told me a few years ago about an over-the-road truck. It was a tractor trailer, not a utility vehicle, that just happened to be stopped at a stoplight and was hit from behind by a civilian, and there was a lawsuit, and they found out that that truck driver was out of hours of service. And there was a huge financial settlement to the plaintiff from the trucking company and the driver, because the court ruled that if the driver had observed the hours of service, his truck would not have been at that intersection and the accident would not have happened. By extension, utilities that don't abide by these laws may or may not get a ticket or may or not have their fleets put out of service, but they are subject to huge civil liabilities. And the utility industry, I think, is just now beginning to wake up to that. Next slide. So what kind of delays are we talking about? Well, obviously, there's the first delay that you can have is the delay for the deployment. So we've been called to respond to another utility. We go through our process of determining which trucks are going to be going, and then we have to get together VIN numbers, and we have to get together license plate numbers, and so on. And then we have to apply for the permits, and from that point, the clock starts ticking, and it's going to be about 12 hours. All right. Just as an example, I was in the MoDOT director's office a few years back, and we had a major restoration event going on, and the phone rang, and it was a weight scale from Oklahoma, and they were calling to tell her that they had about 50 Texas utility trucks, and I don't know who they called, but they had been delayed for 12 hours at the weight scale because they didn't have operating authority in Oklahoma. They had the Missouri emergency declaration in their hand, but that did not give them operating authority to travel through Oklahoma. She was able to convince them finally to let them come through into Missouri. So that's an example of deployment delays. Next slide. Then there's the issue of redeployment delays. So if Ameren responds to a disaster call and we get the permits and we travel to South Carolina and we work for a couple of days, and then all of a sudden we're redeployed 3 states to the north, we don't have operating authority through the pass-through states. Even if there's a handshake agreement legally, we don't have, from a civil liability standpoint, we don't have operating authority to go through those pass-through states. So we have to shut down and wait another 12 hours or whatever it takes to get the appropriate permits. Next slide. And then there's the case of where we just need some emergency movement. We had a large ice storm in southern Missouri and southern Illinois in 2009. and we had linemen from northern Missouri who'd been sent down to southern Missouri. They'd worked all day, and it's into the evening, and we didn't have time, and there are no hotels in the local area. We don't want to put these guys, make them sleep in their trucks if we don't have to, because they've been hard physical labor. And we identified 200 hotel rooms just across the border in Paducah, Kentucky. So I called the DOT in Kentucky and asked for permission to cross into their state. And I was told no, because it's not their disaster and you don't have operating authority. If you want operating authority, then you can apply for it. Obviously, that wasn't the answer we needed. Then there's the issue of advanced deployment. Miles, are we still good here? Hello?
Yeah, Cal, sorry, I'm not smart enough to operate my mute button, but I am smart enough to operate your slide deck, so we're in the right spot. Carry on.
Okay, thank you. Advanced deployment. This happens a lot in the wintertime where there's an ice storm or a snowstorm on the way, and obviously we need to get to the disaster area before that hits, or we'll either be caught on the way in or we won't be able to get in. And typically, emergency declaration will not have been issued in advance. And so we need advanced deployment. We need a way to get through the pass-through states to the affected state before the storm hits. And the next one then is the return home. And that presents another delay. You might think that's leisurely, and sometimes it is. Maybe we've been out for 10 days, and now we need to return home. We shut down, we get more permits to travel home. Or it might not be. It could be in a storm season that we've been out for 10 days, and now in our home state we have a disaster pending or actually happening, and we need to get there quickly. Once again, we're impeded by that. And I think it's good to note too that as Tom had said earlier, and Miles, is there's been some efforts to contact states and just basically work out handshake agreements for pass-through. But I think the civil liability points out that we really can't settle for that. We really need a formal, legally platformed solution to this problem. We actually have to have some kind of agreement or legislation that gives us legal authority to pass through these states during emergencies. Something like the civil defense or something that's readily recognized. I talked about readily recognized and understood. I talked about the Oklahoma incident, and that points out the fact that if we just settle this at a high level, it's still the local law enforcement, the highway patrol at the weigh station, or it's a trooper that's on the side of the highway and sees these trucks and they don't have operating authority. It has to be something that is formal legally and understood by everyone, because it's enforced at that level, and they need to understand it as well as everyone else. Handshake agreements, people that retire or change jobs, we're going to be looking at this over and over and over again, and it's not, even if we get those things, it's not an answer to our civil liability issues. Next slide. As we look for a solution, it's probably a good idea to ask ourselves, what are the issues with the states? And over the years and working with different states on declarations and questions, this is what I think it boils down to. Obviously, there's the issue of lost revenue. If the utilities don't get the permits, then there is a lost revenue. For example, it might cost us $30,000 to get to a storm on the East Coast and back with a couple of hundred trucks. So those utilities that ignore it, or if there's no formal process, there may or may not be an issue of lost revenue with the states. I've talked to IFTA and IRP, and they lead me to believe that if the states look at the bigger picture, it's such a minute amount compared to their normal revenue that we may be able to work around that. I'm going to skip to this third one, fraud. There are states that have concerns about that. During emergency declarations, they'll tell you stories about dump trucks who they've pulled over and they had an emergency declaration in their hand, and they said they were responding to the storm, or they needed an exemption from hours of service and they were working on the storm. But in reality, they had not been invited by a utility to help with the restoration effort. They're a private business, and they had seen an opportunity to make some money, and they're out there trying to do that, and they've crossed state lines to do it, and they don't have operating authority. You might find a local tree trimmer or electrician doing the same thing. But what states need to understand is utilities are not like that. They don't need to fear fraud from utilities. And when it's a blue sky day everywhere, we won't have an electric utility that just says, well, we're going to pack up some crews and we're going to go 2 states away and we're going to build some line just so we can make some extra money. Electric utilities don't do that. The third issue is state sovereignty, and that's, I guess, the most touchy one. It's another way of saying politics, but the states obviously see these as their borders, and they are. And that's why even the U.S. Army has to get permits to cross state lines. Well, they should. I mean, they've got the biggest guns. The question is who's going to stop them. But the state's borders are sovereign. And any agreement we have that comes out of this is going to have to go one of 2 ways, as I see it. Either the states are going to have to get together and agree to do this. And when I say this, I think probably the idea is to pre-register these vehicles as emergency response vehicles and get the states to recognize that, give them some legal status for this. Or if that doesn't happen, we're going to have a major disaster one of these days, and the issue is going to come up, and the federal government may have to step in. And I don't know how that's going to play out with the federal government telling the states what to do with their state sovereignty. And then, Miles, can we transfer to that last slide with the flag? I can't tell you how I felt when I contacted Kentucky and was told that they're not interested in helping us because it's not their disaster. It hit me emotionally. Of course, when you're involved in one of these storms, it's a very hard thing anyway to go through 10 days of restoration and maybe 3 days of sleep. But to see that kind of lack of cooperation, and I know like I said, there's state sovereignty issues and nobody wants to get in trouble. But I really feel that for the good of the country, we need to find a solution to this problem, and we need to all pull together and recognize that just because someone else is in a different state and we're not affected and we're in blue skies, they're still fellow Americans and we need help. So that's my story, Miles, and I'm sticking to it.
All right. Well, hopefully you'll hold up under withering cross-examination there, Cal. Thanks for spending time with us, walking us through that. I am going to go ahead and throw out the first question, which is most of the folks who are on here who are listening in, it's kilowatt geeks of various stripes. Some are companies and some are feds. A bunch of us are state public utility commissions. This kind of feels like there is a fix to some of the immediate problem, which is the operating authority problem. And we'll talk in just a sec about what some of the associated kind of questions are. But it feels like this is a transportation department and maybe emergency management problem, and maybe not a pitch down the middle of the commissioner wheelhouse. So my first question is that true? Am I wrong in that understanding? And second of all, to follow up on that, if it is or isn't something that's a pitch down the Public Utility Commissioner strike zone, we cared profoundly about getting the lights back on, high reliability of service, great assurance of uninterrupted supply to customers, to business customers and residential customers and all that. So I know our squad is going to be interested in being a part of steering us all towards the fix. So first of all, how big of a role does a Public Utility Commission have in the middle of this? And whether we're in the middle of this or not, what is it that a commission that's interested in kind of weighing in on the operating authority piece, how do we get involved in a helpful way?
Tom or myself?
Tom, let's start. Tom, are you there? Let's start with you, and then
Yeah.
Cal, if you want to illustrate that with anything that's specific from your experiences, that'd be cool.
Well, first, that's a great question, Miles. Let me just say, I don't speak for any specific state or company, so I'm not their representative. I can just tell you what I've observed as we've worked through the last several ice storms and hurricane seasons. So the players that get involved, at least from my perspective, when we do fleet movement, in a state that is declared, it's very simple. The emergency management director is in charge, and he or she can move all the obstacles around and make it happen. And that's an ad hoc kind of thing. I think what Cal is advocating is, how do we make this kind of independent of that manual process? I don't know the answer to that. What I find interesting, though, is in the blue sky states, in some states, because you're dealing with toll, with weigh stations, with permits, you're dealing with declaration, in some states you could have as many as 7 people involved in this process, right? So I don't know if regulation, I guess my question is, does regulation impact all of that? Or could we find a way where we could put a solution like Cal is proposing, that we could work something with the emergency managers, who clearly are cabinet level positions at the governor's office, and the governors turn to these directors and say, is this viable? Is this practical? You know, will this help get the power on quicker? So the emergency managers have to be involved, but if there's many others that need to be involved. So I guess from my perspective, Miles, I don't know if I don't know how, just not that they can't. I don't know how the commissioners can provide insight to that, or help craft a solution, or provide input to a solution that could do that. That's just my perspective. I was stunned that in some states you had that many cooks in the kitchen for this issue. So anyway, Cal, any thoughts on your end?
Yes. Now you got to remember, when it comes to politics, I defer to you guys because I'm just a cowboy from Central Missouri. But as I see this unfolding, and we were very fortunate to have representatives from the governor's conference at our meeting in D.C. a few weeks ago as well. And the one message I wanted them to hear is this is an opportunity for the states to fix this first, and to fix it the way the states would like to see it fixed, and that's basically the governors. And if they miss this opportunity, sooner or later we're going to be caught, because the public really doesn't know about this. They don't know that potentially lights could have been on a day or two earlier if it weren't for these red tape delays. But if we miss this opportunity, then sooner or later the federal government's going to have to come down on this, and the public's going to demand some action. So when that happens, when the governors start hearing about this, we're already working with the emergency management agencies through Homeland Security and Tom's great organization up there, the All Hazards. But also, so the governors, when they start hearing about this, I see it happening a couple different ways. Maybe the emergency management agencies go to the governor, or maybe the governors hear about it, but then they go to the emergency management agencies for advice and for counsel. And I can see the possibility that they would also go to the public service commissions for counsel. And in that case, I think it's important for the PSC to be informed, and if asked, to be able to give the right question, the right answer.
Great point. Yes.
Let me ask another question. Part of the operating authority question goes back to that the trucks almost never leave the state, except for the fact that, and the crews and the like, and the contractors that travel with the crews, and the, Joe's chainsaw and pickup truck subcontractor company who's helping clear the roads so that the trucks can get through, and all that other nonsense. Generally, the idea is that they don't leave the state, so that's why they're not equipped from a licensing and policy and authority basis to operate interstate. Run by us. You touched on this at the beginning of your speech, at the beginning of your presentation, Cal. But run by us. Why isn't it the fix to equip those trucks as if they'd be ready to go across those state lines using the standard commercial operators kind of institutional stuff. Is it a function of expense? Is it a function of building a church for Easter Sunday? Why isn't that the fix?
Well, like I said, like you said in my bio, I've been out of fleet since 2009, but and since then, unified carrier registration has come in. But apportion plates, part of it is expense. Apportion plates are very expensive. Prior to unified carrier registration, I don't know how it is now, but states had different requirements. And if you didn't, some states said, well, if you don't travel a certain number of miles in our state routinely, then you can't get an apportion plate for our state. You have to get temporary permits. And then, of course, there's the record keeping that's involved in it. There's no record keeping involved if you're not actually traveling, but the utility that is a second tier, for example, Xcel Energy during the Hurricane Sandy event, they were delayed by 48 hours from responding from Colorado. They were asked to go all the way from Colorado to New York, but they're what I call a second tier utility when it comes to response. They don't get called that often, and so this was totally new to them. How to get permits, and do they get permits, or do they try to get declarations? And they are not going to, especially your second tier utilities, are not going to receive approval to get apportion plates for the expense, when they may never respond, or even if they have a fleet of 1,000 vehicles, only 30% of them would ever respond to a disaster. But then again, it depends on the size of the disaster. So, but you do bring up a good point, Miles. And one of the solutions or proposals that I had thought about would be a special license plate. Once again, the states would all have to get together to agree with this, but it might be a utility plate, and it would extend down in size even to the smaller vehicles. That would be as easily identifiable as the old civil defense decals were. And law enforcement would just be educated to the fact that these vehicles, because they don't take advantage of economic opportunities to travel across state lines, the only time they're doing that is for disaster restoration, would be allowed to travel where they need to, when they need to.
I've got a bunch of really great questions coming in as well. One of them is from Commissioner Paul Roberti, who asks, how do utility mergers affect these restoration efforts? Do bigger footprints help make a difference? And in the case of a mutual assistance question, are the existing mutual assistance frameworks adequate? So basically, does it help to have a bigger company, and do mergers affect the requirement and the continuation of the mutual assistance agreements?
Well, I think a bigger company, I would ask the question, is it a bigger company all in one state, or is it a bigger company in several states? Because if you have with mutual aid agreements, if you have X number of line trucks available to respond to an emergency response, it doesn't matter what the name is on the door. So bigger really wouldn't affect that. Tom, did you have any idea on that as well?
No, it's a great question. I agree, Cal, with what you just said. A truck is a truck, no matter whose logo's on it. And the RMAGs are condensing now as part of that. I think we've seen it go from 9 to 7. I think there's 7 now. I think what it does cause is churn and confusion sometimes with the states, because there's new people that comes in. All the more reason I think it drives. We need a blue sky solution for these, infrequent but high impact type of scenarios. Okay. Because it doesn't happen every day. We hope it doesn't happen every day at least. But when it does, this is a big issue. And Cal, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought about half of the fleet movement that I've heard of is contractors versus the utilities themselves. And
well,
can you speak to that for a minute? Because I think the contractors are set up differently. We're talking about the utility. We're talking about the utilities themselves, not their subs, right?
We're talking about the utility vehicles right now.
That's what I thought. Okay.
The contractors, and Tom Gwaltney from Florida Power and Light brought this up at our DC meeting. Anywhere from 50 to 80% of a particular storm, it could be 50% or more, are contractors, and typically line contractors and tree trimming contractors already have apportioned license plates. That's their business to travel from state to state.
Yeah,
but
so
it's the utility trucks that don't. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Now, having said that, we understand how important it is to get the lights on first. We also understand that that's not the end of the disaster restoration. I've been approached by the EPA because I did a presentation at a MOEMA conference, and there was a water department company there, and there are water companies that hook up backhoes to dump trucks and cross state lines to help with disaster restoration. There's other utilities, or telecom, and so on and so forth. If we do this right, then down the road we will have laid a template that can be expanded to other restoration utilities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Sandy had food, trucks from all over the place, fuel, water, supply, construction, trailers, tractors, trailers. It was crazy. So you're right, Cal. I think there's all the more reason for this. So I hope we answered the question, but.
Yeah, I think that's a good start. Let me broaden. We don't have a ton of time to explore all these other issues, but I just want to flag a few of the other issues and just get a quick piece of feedback confirming whether or not these are real things or not. But I've been in the room with you guys and in other situations where issues about access and credentialing to make sure that utility workers can get into areas that have been closed up in disaster situations remains a problem. I'm counting on my fingers here just in case you can't tell that that's what I'm doing. So access and credentialing remains a problem. That tolls at bridges and on toll roads kind of still remain a problem, and that questions about how to deal with way stations and other kinds of policy-oriented delays, that those still remain kind of question marks. That those are not things that commissioners have a big piece of. But is that understanding correct, that we still have just sort of a small universe of little bits and pieces where commercial vehicle movement doesn't quite interface with utility restoration crews? Is that list, kind of still a list?
So, Miles, this is Tom. Let me take a crack at that very quickly. So, access and credentialing, I've been working that issue within the consortium for 10 years. Now, this is just me talking, okay? I'm not speaking for any jurisdiction or company. For access and credentialing to work, it is going to take 100 moving parts. I'm exaggerating. A lot of moving parts to synchronize together. This is going to take policy. This is going to take standards. It's going to take funding. And it's going to take training to be synchronized across the country, public and private, for that to work. And that is just not a reality, okay? And part of it is you've got states carry the burden, and the cities carry the burden for implementing the process with the local police, who typically guard the access corridor, right? So every cop and every truck driver, which can change, it needs to be involved in a process where the things can be read, the data can be validated, and they're allowed in. The cost and expense for that is way beyond what the states have money for. Some states that have initiated access and credentialing, I belong to a national group of them. There's an election, the priorities come in, the money shifts, and the program is shut down. So it is, at the state level, it's very difficult to implement this from a technology standpoint and managing the identity and the attributes of those people in the public and private sector is just really hard. Now, that said, there are some other efforts going on that are a little lighter weight, and what they've done is separate credentialing from access, right? So North Carolina just focused on access. So they worked with Lowe's to come up with a process that's kind of a placard thing you print. It doesn't validate your credential, right? Meaning, I am who I say I am a surgeon, I'm allowed into there. That's a credential. That's not going to be validated in this step. But access is just getting in beyond the yellow tape to fix it. And there's been some good efforts working that. The credentialing side is just a quagmire of cost, policy, technology, and training that is just very difficult to do, and you have to stay on top of it, and it's resource hungry. And then there's elections, and elections disrupt the whole process because it's not formalized yet anywhere. So that's my perspective. That's my perception. We are working a credentialing issue, but not on physical access. We're doing it with securing information. So we're using credentialing to secure identities, to share sensitive information, public to private, and that's working well. It's a lot simpler. I don't need 7,000 people in Virginia to have that. I just need the right 12 or 15 people to have that so we can get the electric sector's movement information and then process it. So data sharing with credentialing is a much lighter lift, and it could start the process going. But when you're talking about credentialing matching with access to a restricted area, that is just, I just want everybody to know that's a tough one, and it's going to take a long time to fix with the current approach. That's my, Cal, I don't know if you have any perception on it, but that's kind of that's my take.
Yeah, you've obviously done a lot of work on that, Tom, and I couldn't agree with you more. The one thing that what we're working on here could do for us, and I'm thinking about the Joplin tornado, is if there's a recognized decal or license plate or whatever that we come up with that can educate that, and the local sheriff deputy as well as the highway patrol knows that is the purpose of that is to give access, then as depending on the access level they've been instructed to give, it may help clarify that yes, this is a utility vehicle and it needs to come in. Would you agree with that, Tom?
Yes, and you said something very important there, Cal. If you can get small, meaning narrowly focused on an issue like the electric utility, then it works. The states and the federal government have a tough time doing that because when they do it, they got to do the whole ocean. They got to do the utilities and the water. They can't just do it for one sector, and that's a problem. But what you just described is the workaround that I think is very effective. And so how can you work the best practices out of that into something that's a little broader? Because like everything, when you go multi-state, it just gets really hard. So no, I think that's a good example what you brought up there because it's very focused. Right.
And the same thing with the toll roads. We've been working with Neil Gray from the International Bridge, Tunnel, and Turnpike Association, and they've struggled with this issue of emergency vehicles for a long time, and it is a safety issue even when you line 50 utility trucks up at a toll booth. But we're hoping that if we get this pre-registration done, it'll give them a basis to work with for a solution as well. Now the weight scales. We face a number of uphill challenges with the operating authority issue, and obviously at this time we want to focus on that and not muddy the waters with these other issues, but the weight scales do present another delay, and Chris, that may be something that is best handled by, and Tom, you can pipe in on this, agree or disagree, with more of a less of a handshake agreement at this time. Chris Geldart has been working with, he's the Director of Homeland Security for District of Columbia, and he's been working with some of the emergency management agencies and DOT in the East Coast states to basically come up with these handshake agreements to close weight scales when these utility convoys come through. And if we get the operating authority issue resolved, then I think for the time being that may be the best way to approach the weight scale issue.
Cal, thank you for that. Guys, I hate to do this, but we are totally out of time. So I hope, friends, remember what commissioners can do is ask questions and set expectations. So as you take this away, I wonder if this is something that gets conjoined to the questions that you're asking as utilities talk about their national level readiness work, as they talk about other kinds of work, asking them questions about where y'all can be useful, what kinds of connections can be made. Maybe this is an area for further investigation.
Yeah.
For next.
Hey, Miles, this is Tom. If there are some commissioners that would like to get in the kitchen with us on this, please send me their names, because we think if we come up with the right solution that's visual and simple, we may knock off the access part of this, not the credentialing, but we may kill two birds with one stone. So if there are any commissioners who would like to work with us on this, it's all virtual, so we do it via conference call. We'd love to invite them into the kitchen with us.
You got it, Tom. So guys, next week we're talking about the retention of existing nuclear units. It's going to be a real interesting conversation. How do we keep those nuke units that we want to keep in the game in the face of operating and economic pressures? I hope you'll come back next Friday for that conversation. We got a couple great speakers lined up for that as well. The week after that, we're taking a break, but then thereafter, we'll keep doing our summertime webcast series. Friends, I hope you'll join me in thanking Tom and Cal for their presentation today. This has been recorded, and it will be posted by Monday on the NARUC website. Thanks again for your time, friends. You don't have to go home, but you can't sleep here.